Okay. This is my second attempt at this, so we shall see if maybe I can make this work a little bit better. So I wanted to go over a few details on Northup over chapters 19 through 21. You have a quiz on Monday/Tuesday, depending on A or B day class, and so I'm not going to let you use your book. This is only 3 chapters. You've had plenty of time to read it and kind of digest the information, and so I know there's a lot going on, but I think this is I think you can manage this. But I did think that in lieu of talking about it in class, that I would go ahead and talk about the book, and then hopefully this will help you get ready for the quiz. So I'm going to try to do this very quickly. See if last time I was having some issues. So you have in chapter 19, you have this idea of, the meeting of Bass, right, and who he is. Note that Epps is doing financially well enough that he can afford a house. He's paying a carpenter, and this is no cheap undertaking. So yes, Epps is fulfilling his dream of being successful, and I think it's interesting to kind of note that. Also note that Bass is very much, he's able to say things that are kind of outrageous simply because he's different. And he's from Canada, and he's not a property owner. Yes, he's popular, he's known for being generous, people like him, but he definitely has different viewpoints. And notice that most Southerners laugh at him behind his back. And I've mentioned this before, that with minstrel shows, with blackface, Larry the Cable Guy, Jeff Dunham, they can get away with saying outrageous things because they're being outrageous characters, and somehow it's easier to kind of take that kind of political critique over complicated issues and kind of look at it when the person doing it is a buffoon. And I certainly think that you get a sense that that's how they look at Bass. Now, obviously, they admire his skill. This is somebody that has a skill that's not common, as we talked about with Tibbetts, right? This is not stuff that you don't find carpenters lying under rocks down there. As my husband would say, it's not like you go to the quarterback tree and pick a quarterback. You don't go to the carpenter tree and say, oh, hey, yeah, I'm going to take this carpenter and go build me a house. So he's got a skill that's in demand, and so this is going to make him valuable. That's going to allow him to get away with a little bit. And so we've got 2 different types of people that can break the rules in Southern society. The wealthy, like William Ford, and as we saw later in this book, Mistress McCoy. Sorry, my Yorkie's wanting to come up here. And so you definitely see that they're able to get away with this stuff, but so is Bass. And his whole idea that, that he is going to be, that he's in demand, but he's also seen as, well, we can let him say this outrageous stuff because, well, he's from Canada anyways. What does he know? So I think that's very important to kind of note. Also notice he traveled around a lot, very typical for what we've talked about with the regionalization of America, the seeking of opportunity, and that kind of thing. And 178, 179 are a couple of pages you need to kind of pay attention to because this is where Bass expresses his argument against slavery. Now, Northup throughout this book has argued against slavery, and you definitely see that this is a running theme for him. But I think that you also see with Bass that another voice adding to that. And this is, it's kind of like Northup is saying, it's not just, if you don't trust me, a black man who's survived slavery, then you can trust this white man. And keep in mind, this is not a radical abolitionist, although certainly he had abolitionist tendencies. But this is a man who'd been living down south, working with slaves, participating with the system. This is not William Lloyd Garrison by any stretch of the imagination. So just kind of keep that in mind that he's making this argument. Notice that there's a couple of key components that I want to talk about as far as his argument is concerned. First one, the role of credit. Bass clearly lays credit as, this credit system. And we've talked about this going all the way back into the colonial period, how tobacco relied on, letters of credit, and how, when we talked about kind of the interchange of banks and planters in the creation of the Constitution, right? I mean, planters had to rely on credit to survive, and this was true whether you were a big planter or a small planter. And so you were constantly in debt, constantly paying off debt. And so you have Bass clearly saying that slavery is a part of that credit system, and that's really where the evil lies. So he's laying the foundation for slavery being wrong, really at the feet of this credit system that violates what makes a man free and independent and at liberty. Which brings me to the next thing that I want to point out. You definitely see Bass kind of calling out these notions of what America stands for, the notions of liberty, the notions of individualism, and, equality, populism, laissez-faire, those kinds of things. And he's clearly saying, well, maybe not clearly saying, but I think you can apply de Tocqueville's values to his argument, in that what we see is that Bass is arguing that slavery flies in the face of all of this, and that we need to be very conscientious about how that works. He talks about the law being a liar, the law of all men are created equal, and that liberty, you know, if it either promises liberty or it doesn't, and slavery clearly makes the law a liar. This is another trend I want you to kind of notice in this section of books, is the role of the law. The law factors very prominently in these three chapters. The extent to which they have to go to legally prove that Northup is free, the extent that they have to go through, the legal hoops they have to go through. And this is all built on top of what we've already talked about, which is the notion that legally what slaves could and couldn't do, whether that was Tibbets, the role of Chapin interrupting Tibbets and trying to kill Platt, or whether it's, we talked about, slaves not being able to give testimony. You have the law saying, well, your master controls what you do, and yet we see that the law can also be used to set Northup free. But the law is kind of this harsh master, and you can see that it can be good and it can be bad. And we've kind of talked about this before, that just because the law says you have a right to do something doesn't mean it's good, doesn't mean you should. And I think that that's kind of an important concept we need to, that we still have this moral culpability. Just because slavery was the law of the land, does that allow us to be morally complacent in ignoring slavery? And you definitely see Bass kind of having an epiphany about that. And so I'll come back to that more here in a second. But he talks about the law being a liar. You see he and Epps having this argument over whether slaves are men or not, and Bass clearly is suggesting that what you see is that slaves have not been given the opportunity to be themselves, to learn, to make the most of who they are. Sorry, I need to tea. And so that because they haven't been allowed the right to be individuals, that this system, this law, has denied them their basic individual rights. And we're not talking about the liberty factor. We're talking about the right to know enough to make something of yourself. If that's the key component of individualism that we all believe in with the American dream, I can make of myself what I want, what I'm capable of, and I can make good choices, right? So Bass is arguing that they've been denied that fundamental right, all in the name of the law. And so I think that is a very powerful, very compelling argument to hold on to. So just kind of keep that in mind. And we certainly see, and when we get to the 20th century and we talk about the separate but equal laws that kind of reinstate the social system that we see existing here, I think it's very interesting to note that Brown v. Board will go a long way to changing that. That separate but equal, which is what the South tries to do, to say, oh, well, we can keep our peculiar institution or something that's very much like it, as long as we create equal opportunity. Except there is no such thing as separate but equal, and how does that affect individualism? So I think that's an important kind of concept to keep in mind. And so you see him developing his argument against slavery. I think it's very important. Those are two very important pages here. And then, of course, you see Epps, laughing at him, kind of making fun of him. And again, that this is how they can get away with that. And then you see how Platt, Northup begins to reach out to Bass, and how Bass kind of has this realization of who Northup is. And you see him clearly being affected by the situation, and Bass knows the danger. Right, just because it was okay for him to be perceived as this eccentric carpenter who's really no real threat to the system, in all of his crazy viewpoints that we can all laugh at and that kind of thing. There's a big difference between that and him actually doing something to set Bass free. But you can clearly see that for Bass, he reaches that point, that moment of awareness. And remember, one of my notes in here say it takes just one. It takes one moment. It takes one person that says, you know what, just because I can continue to participate in this system, I'm going to make the moral choice to do what is right, and I'm going to stand up. That somehow, that choosing to take care of yourself morally, to do the morally right thing, even in the face of law that's not being applied correctly, even in the face of a system that's clearly skewed. I mean, and Bass was a man who had participated. He had been paid by these slave owners. He had worked with slaves. You saw his response when Northup first says, "Oh, I know where Canada is," and Bass is like, "What? How would you know?" This is not somebody who is convinced of the equality of races, but this is also somebody that chooses in this one moment, I'm no longer going to be morally culpable in enslaving other people. My moral viewpoints now demand action, and he chooses to do that. And I think this is a very important lesson for you to take as emerging adults, and I think it's a very important piece of the story for why Northup is able to gain his freedom. And so I think that's incredibly important. You also see kind of that they get together on writing the letter. And of course, again, notice the danger, the fear that Northup has about being discovered, the fear that Bass has about being discovered. And, pay special attention on 184, the letter, and how the letter's written, especially the postscript. You see Northup referring to the fact that they included a section of that letter, apparently in an edition of Uncle Tom's Cabin, but he was very unhappy with how they did it, and that they left off the postscript, which he says on 185 is crucial to him actually being found. And so I think you need to pay special attention to that. And again, we see the role of the law coming into play, not only holding people in bondage, but in setting Northup free, and this incredible irony that's going on there. And so you definitely see him, Bass kind of fighting for him and sending the letters, taking this huge risk. Then chapter 20 really goes into Christmas, and you see kind of a snapshot into Southern life at Christmas time and how important Christmas was to the slaves, this notion of a few days of actual liberty. So you see again these de Tocqueville terms kind of working their way, and there's no indication that Northup was even thinking about de Tocqueville, but I think it's important for you as a student to see how de Tocqueville's values shape so much of how we understand American history. And you certainly see, again, Bass talking about, he's tired of living in the South, that he's decided he's going to leave. This is when he says, I'll travel to New York, I'll find these people, I'll send somebody after you, that I've had enough with the system. And I think that's very interesting. And so you kind of hear, you hear Epps kind of talking about how delicate Northup is. He can't take a whipping, that kind of thing. And in Epps's mind, he's doing Platt some great favor because he understands this, and I find that kind of ridiculous. And you see Mistress McCoy, another good owner. Notice she's a single woman, but she can't control her own property. Her brother-in-law has to do that for her. And so really there's not a whole lot in chapter 20 other than it just kind of adds another layer to the story. I do want to point out that, we have this notion of factory workers up north and slave workers down south. There's many similarities to their conditions, and yet there's also some glaring differences. So be sure that you kind of understand that up north you would have worked long hours. You would have had, you would have been a very vulnerable person as far as your diet, as far as your housing, as far as your children went. And so factory workers up north had a lot to deal with, but of course slaves down south, nothing changes the ability of masters to rape women and break apart families and really violate people's freedoms, as you'll see in chapter 21 when Epps talks about, oh, well, hey, I would have hidden you if I'd had any idea this was going to happen. That's not going to happen to factory workers. So I think it's kind of interesting to note that. And so you definitely see, beginning in 21, kind of the role of Northern racism, Northern paternalism. Remember that all of this has to be done through white men. Northup himself cannot claim his freedom. Northup himself, no blacks up north can come down and claim him to be free. This has to be white men doing it. And again, we mentioned this when we first read the book, how much Northup had to go through to be a moderately successful person. And clearly the North is not going to support pure equality of the races. There's a great deal of racism that happens there, and yet there's also this idea of justice. And so, I mean, I don't want to make it into something it's not, but I also think it's important to recognize the role of paternalism here, and how, and this will really factor in as we get farther into U.S. history, farther into the modern period. You certainly see that in the abolitionist movement, especially after this, as the Emancipation Proclamation comes out and stuff, there's a real break between black abolitionists and the white abolitionists, and blacks like Frederick Douglass getting really frustrated with this notion that freedom has to be given by white men, and that's kind of ridiculous. And certainly if you remember from the snippet that I played you of what to the American slave is your 4th of July, you definitely kind of get a flavor of how Frederick Douglass would have felt about that. And so that will certainly, when we get to the Black Power movement of the 60s and 70s, again, you're going to see many of these civil rights organizations begin to be claimed by black members who say, no, this is our fight, this isn't a white person's fight. And so I think that this is a theme that you need to not forget, that for so much of American history, civil rights had to be fought for by white men. They couldn't be fought for by the people, by the women that were trying to achieve equality, by the blacks that were trying to achieve equality, by the Latinos that were trying to achieve equality. And so I think it's very important to kind of grasp that. The level of proof that they have to go through to prove that he's a free person, which is very, I think, enlightening there. Notice that Henry Northup, the white guy from up north, who's kind of, his family would have once owned Solomon's family, and he's the one that really kind of takes hold of this, travels to Washington, D.C., speaks to the Louisiana senator. You definitely also see this break between these Southern intellectuals, Southern wealthy planters, politicians that recognize that this crime done to Northup can't stand, that slavery is this delicate house of cards, and if we start, if people can be snatched in New York and brought in slavery, then it challenges the whole system, and they don't want it to be like that, and they want it to have a legal standing. So this is kind of where that law cuts both ways, so to speak. So I think it's very important to see that you have men, whether it's the senator from Louisiana, whether it's the attorney Waddell, that they're standing up for what's right, because they are as concerned about perpetuating the system of slavery as a legal institution, as opposed to, say, Tibbetts or Epps, who, for them, slavery is a means to an end. It's an economic system. It's a social class system. And so I think it's very interesting to kind of talk about that. You also see the influence of divine providence in this. Very clearly, there's several parts in these 3 chapters where, things come to be, whether it's Northup going to Marksville, whether it's catching bass before he leaves on a boat. All of these things come into being and are very interesting in the fact, that there seems to be a greater hand guiding the system. Now, whether this is simply Northup's expression of personal faith that God was watching out for him, whether there's a more complex meaning that God will exact justice for slavery, that's up to you to decide. But I definitely think you see the role of divine providence happening here. And you see them having this conversation on 198 about politics in the 1850s and how chaotic it is. And we'll be talking about this in class. But notice also that this conversation about politics leads them to talking about bass. And this causes them to think about the postscript. And thinking about the postscript makes them go, maybe we should go find this guy Bass, because maybe he's got some information for us. And this is how they catch him. So I think that's a very interesting little tidbit as part of how the story ends up. Notice their need for discretion, the fact that they have to be very secretive about how they do this. Matter of fact, they end up deciding that they have to leave at midnight to go out to the bayou, boof, however you say that, that they have to go out there. And so you see them really figuring out that, they better act quickly. Remember that the law may be the law, but the law can lie, and the law's not always right. And and they realize that Epps is not going to let Platt Northup go just because, well, the law says so. And so they begin to act in ways that are very much indicate really how destructive the system of slavery is and how it really kind of hurts everything. And so you see that, and you see them going through. They have a whole plan worked out for how the sheriff is going to interview Northup Platt to kind of add another layer of legality. I find the whole exchange with Epps to be particularly fascinating, that they bring Platt and, hey, Platt, go cut some firewood while I talk to these men in here. And here's Platt out there cutting firewood knowing that these men are talking about his freedom. There's something just so bizarre about this particular exchange to me. And so I think that that's very interesting. Notice that Mistress Epps is only concerned with herself. Again, the moral decay that comes from slavery, that it takes a woman who, could be kind and understanding, and yet all she can think about is who's going to mend the furniture and who's going to play the violin for me. This is how miserable and unhappy she is, because this is what slavery does. Epps, who could care so little about what is right, that he would say openly, I would have gotten him away from you had I had any idea this was about to happen. And you definitely see how this whole system, forces these men, whether it's Waddell, whether, that they have to act in ways to prevent kind of the moral decay from kind of spreading and taking over, because, slavery is just wrong, and it was just evil, and there was no way around it. Notice that they leave very, very quickly, that they know that there's going to be a threat if they stay around. In fact, the decision is made by the judge to forego the legal hearing, that he's seen enough proof, get this guy out of here. From the rich, wealthy Southerner perspective, first off, you don't want this example hanging around because it makes you look really bad. But also, they recognize that their social structure is very, very delicate, and that men like Epps and Tibbets, who have claimed their right to whiteness, as being the only thing that differentiates them from other people, right? If that's the key, they're not going to let that go just because some guy happens to have free papers. So I think that's a very important message for you to kind of grasp. So be sure you pay special attention to kind of the flow of this book. And like I said, these issues on the law, these issues about divine providence, the argument. Sorry, I'm fixing my sock. That you have these things happening in the story. It's only 3 chapters, so you should be able to handle it pretty well. And I found it interesting. I talked about this actually a little bit more when I did the first recording that didn't work. I've been reading this particular book, and this book has a whole lot to say about kind of that system of credit, this idea of race as being a way to differentiate a poor white family from a poor black family. And I think there's a lot of interesting things going on there. So I just found it kind of fascinating to be reading this other book over the Thanksgiving break, and to see how these very systems that Northup is talking about, the economic structure, the labor structure, the racial component, that's still at play in the 1930s. It doesn't go away just because we end slavery. And in fact, I would suggest to you that in many ways, and I've kind of called to this all throughout this little lecture, I guess you could say, is that there's systems in place in our modern society, economically, legally, that cause us to be morally complacent, cause us to be morally culpable in things we see around us that are wrong, and how we should stand up for those things. That we should challenge systems that are broken. because they're broken. And just continuing a system, and that's what we see happening with Plessy v. Ferguson and Separate but Equal, is really a reinstitution of this social system, because wealthy white guys down south didn't want to lose that power. I think it's very interesting to kind of point that out. So that's it. 8 questions. Half of them are multiple choice. Half of them are short answer. No book. You should be able to, this should help you kind of work your way through that. I hope you listen to this and then make sure you go back and look through the chapters, pay special attention to the parts that I pointed out to you, and I think you should do well on this quiz. Thank you.